So, Prince William and Catherine just made a decision about who gets to speak for the crown, and it's not one Charles ever expected to hear from his own son. When the king understood what they were telling him, he didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice, he just sat there, silent. Because this wasn't about a title, and it wasn't another family disagreement hidden behind palace doors. William and Catherine were drawing a boundary around who could speak in the monarchy's name once the crown passed to them, and Camilla was standing on the wrong side of that boundary. Before the meeting ended, Charles heard one sentence that made 40 years of royal communications policy collapse around him. Before we get into it, if you want more royal deep dives like this one, hit subscribe to Crown Currents. It takes 2 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel. So, the meeting happened at Windsor Castle on Thursday the 20th of August 2026 at 20 past 6 in the evening. Charles had been told it concerned future communications protocol. That's the kind of dry phrase that usually means style guides, press releases, nothing explosive. Then he walked into the private sitting room and saw William and Catherine waiting. Between them sat a cream folder. 4 words were printed across the front. The next reign voice. Charles sat down and looked from William to Catherine. William didn't open the folder, Catherine did. And that movement changed the room immediately, because it told Charles the decision hadn't come from William alone. Catherine wasn't there as support, she was part of it. When Charles began reading the first page, the future he had quietly assumed for Camilla started to look different. There was no sentence saying Camilla would be silenced, no demand that she stop giving interviews, no attack on her marriage. The wording was colder than that. One sovereign, one office, one voice speaking for the crown once the next reign begins. It sounded administrative until the consequence became clear. If Charles died before Camilla, there would be no automatic right to issue statements in the crown's name. No guaranteed seat among the accredited press, no entry in the court circular describing her as representing the sovereign. No assumption that anything she said publicly carried institutional weight simply because she had once stood beside a king. Camilla could remain family and keep her lawful status. But William and Catherine were making one thing unmistakable. After Charles, only the reigning household would speak for the monarchy. That was the announcement Charles hadn't expected. And the idea hadn't started with William 3 days earlier at Kensington Palace. Catherine had been reading a briefing on the history of royal communications. Most of it was routine until she reached 1957. Queen Elizabeth II delivered the first televised Christmas broadcast in the monarchy's history that year. It was called, at the time, a modernization. It also marked the moment the crown's voice stopped belonging to Parliament and started belonging to the palace's own communications machinery. Catherine read that section twice. Then she found the phrase that changed everything. Institutional voice. She looked across the table and asked what that phrase would mean for Camilla specifically. The answer came carefully. A surviving consort could continue giving interviews, issuing personal statements, appearing at events, being quoted in the press. Catherine listened. Then she asked the question nobody in the room seemed eager to answer. Would Camilla's office still be treated as speaking for the crown? The silence lasted just long enough to answer it on its own. Catherine's concern was never that Camilla might give an interview or attend a family occasion. The problem was structural. A voice with institutional weight means a spokesperson, a distribution list, a name in the court circular, a phrase repeated in newspapers as though it carried the sovereign's authority behind it. Individually, each piece looks harmless. Together they create something else. A second crown voice, speaking beside the new sovereigns. That bothered Catherine specifically because the precedent had existed inside a different family structure. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, had kept her own office issuing her own statements for nearly 50 years after 1952, and nobody in that generation had questioned why. She had been the reigning queen's actual mother. Camilla would be William's stepmother. Catherine herself would be queen. Different relationships, different history, different pressures entirely. Catherine turned to William and asked the question that forced him to stop treating the matter as technical. Were they building their own reign's communication structure or inheriting one built for somebody else's family? William resisted at first. He knew exactly what would happen the moment anyone suggested reducing Camilla's public voice. People would call it censorship. Diana's name would come back into it whether he mentioned her or not. Diana had been silenced too, they'd say, spoken over for years, and now her son was doing it to another woman inside the same family. He wanted no part of that story. Then Catherine said something he hadn't expected. If the rule looked personal, make it apply to her too. William stared at her. Catherine meant it. If William died first and George became king, she wouldn't expect her own words to still carry crown weight once William's reign had ended. No communications office kept running in her name, no automatic entry in the court circular describing her as speaking for the sovereign. She would remain George's mother, she would keep her dignity, and she would keep the causes that mattered to her personally. But the crown's voice, the actual institutional authority to speak for the monarchy, would belong to George. In that moment, the argument changed. This was no longer just about Camilla. It was a rule Catherine was willing to oppose on her own voice first. 3 days later, Charles would read that rule at Windsor and understand that the future he thought was settled had never been settled at all. William didn't answer Catherine immediately. The room at Kensington Palace had gone quiet. But the silence was no longer about Camilla. It was about Catherine. She had just removed the easiest accusation available to anyone watching from outside. If the same rule would bind her one day too, then William couldn't honestly call it a punishment built for one woman. He looked back at the briefing. The problem was larger than any single person. Royal communications had long depended as much on convention as on written structure. One reign ends, another begins, but spokespeople don't vanish overnight. Statements keep circulating under old names. Journalists keep old contacts on file. Offices that existed for decades expect by simple habit to keep existing. William understood that continuity could steady an institution. He also understood Catherine's warning underneath it. Continuity could curdle into entitlement. If nobody ever decided where the old reign's voice stopped and the new one's actually began, Catherine's proposal was severe because it was clean. A surviving consort would keep personal dignity, family standing, private opinions, and the right to speak as herself. But institutional voice, the authority to be quoted as speaking for the crown, would not pass automatically into the next reign. If the new sovereign wanted that person's voice involved, the invitation would come from the new sovereign, not from habit, not from precedent, not because an office had existed for years and expected to keep talking. That distinction changed William's expression. It gave him something he hadn't had before, a principle. He asked the advisors to test it from every direction. What happened to existing spokespeople? What happened to the court circular listings? Which public statements were personal opinion, and which had always depended on crown authority to mean anything at all? Could a former consort give interviews without creating confusion about who actually represented the sovereign? Could a name that had once meant official palace position keep meaning that indefinitely, simply because nobody had ever told it to stop? The answers weren't simple. A rule decided during grief would be vulnerable to emotion and rushed promises. A rule discussed years in advance could be built around structure instead of personalities. William still saw the danger clearly. His mother's name would be pulled into this whether he mentioned Diana or not. Any decision reducing Camilla's public voice could be framed as a son settling an old family score through the press office instead of the courts. He knew exactly how fast that story would travel. He also knew Catherine would be accused of using her own popularity to quiet Camilla before ever becoming queen herself. Catherine had already anticipated it. She made the sacrifice explicit. If William died before her and George inherited the crown, Catherine would not expect the machinery of William's reign to keep amplifying her afterward. She wouldn't demand a communications office because the public loved her. She wouldn't insist old contacts kept treating her words as crown position because they'd done so for years. She wouldn't place George in the position of becoming king, while his own mother's voice still carried institutional authority beside him. The thought was uncomfortable for William to sit with. That discomfort was exactly why it worked. William knew what Catherine's voice meant to George, knew what it would mean to a young heir to watch his own mother's authority quietly step back the moment his reign began. The idea of reducing Catherine's institutional voice after his own death didn't feel clinical to him. It felt personal, yet Catherine was asking him to separate two things the monarchy has always blended without much scrutiny: family love and constitutional authority. One could survive without controlling the other. From that point, the wording tightened. One reign, one office, one voice at the center. The advisors stripped away anything that sounded vindictive. No reference to Camilla by name inside the core principle. No mention of Diana anywhere in it. No language about silencing. No suggestion that a surviving queen consort should be hidden or humiliated. The rule had to be strong enough to genuinely change the structure, and neutral enough to survive the accusation that it had been written for one person. Then someone raised the question everyone had been circling: the press office. The room changed again. A press office can be a small technical unit. It can also become something else. A place where a former consort's opinions still get treated as statements, where a stray remark to a journalist still runs under a headline implying it came from the palace, where a name that once meant crown authority keeps meaning that long after the reign it belonged to has ended. William didn't answer immediately. Catherine watched him. The advisors waited. Camilla's team already had a working relationship with several correspondents that dated back over a decade. Charles knew that relationship intimately. If William and Catherine were serious about one voice, they would eventually have to decide whether the principle stopped at official statements or reached the actual press office itself. That was the moment William understood this couldn't be settled quietly among advisors. Charles had to hear it, not after a leak, not after a headline. A private meeting was arranged at Windsor for the following Thursday evening. The description sent ahead was restrained. Future communications protocol. Charles was given no reason to expect confrontation by the time the folder was ready. Catherine's question had become a rule capable of reshaping how every future reign spoke to the public. One issue remained unresolved: the press office, and Charles was about to ask about it first. By 6:26 that evening, Charles had reached the end of the first page. He looked up slowly. The room no longer felt like a routine meeting about future arrangements. William sat opposite him with his hands folded. Catherine kept the folder open in front of her. His first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. "This is about Camilla," he said. William answered carefully. "It affects Camilla." Charles held his gaze. "That is the same thing." Catherine spoke before William could continue. "No, it isn't." That answer unsettled Charles more than an argument would have. He turned back to the page. A new reign would begin with one sovereign, one central office, one chain of authority over what could be said in the crown's name. A surviving consort could retain personal dignity and family standing, but no spokesperson, no press relationship, no institutional voice would continue by automatic right. Charles stopped at one line. Then he asked the question William had been expecting: what happens to the press office? Nobody answered immediately. That pause carried decades of history. The office wasn't simply a department. It had grown slowly, since the first court circular was published in 1803, into the single mechanism through which the public learned what the monarchy actually believed about anything. Charles had grown up watching his own mother's words travel through it, carrying the full weight of the crown behind them. For Charles, the office had never been neutral machinery. It was proof that what a royal said in public mattered because of who stood behind them. William was preparing to break that assumption. He looked directly at his father. "Nothing is automatic." Charles didn't move. William continued. "Not the office, not the contacts, not the phrasing, not the authority behind it." Each phrase landed separately. That was the part Charles hadn't expected. He'd always known William would shape his own reign's communications one day. He hadn't expected a rule stating that the previous consort's voice could lose its institutional weight the moment the previous king's reign ended. Charles leaned back for the first time. The conversation turned painfully personal. "And if I'm not here to protect her voice," he said. The question changed the atmosphere. The monarch disappeared for a moment. The husband remained. William's expression softened, but his answer didn't. "She won't need protection from us." Charles looked at him. "Then what do you call this?" William waited a second. A boundary. Silence followed. Charles had spent decades waiting for the crown, and now his son was asking him to imagine the day it had already passed on, to picture Camilla alive, still speaking publicly, inside a monarchy whose words no longer belonged to their household at all. Charles turned toward Catherine. Until then, William had carried most of the explanation. Charles seemed to expect Catherine to remain supportive but quiet. Instead, she moved the argument somewhere he hadn't anticipated. "It applies to me too," she said. Charles stared at her. The sentence didn't fit the picture he'd been building in his mind. Catherine continued. If William died before her and George became king, she would accept the same principle. She wouldn't expect George to keep amplifying a separate Catherine voice beside his own reign, simply because she had once been queen. She wouldn't assume old press contacts should keep quoting her as though she still spoke for the crown. She wouldn't demand a permanent institutional platform beside her son's throne. Charles listened without interrupting. Catherine was placing her own future voice inside the rule. That made the argument considerably harder to dismiss. This was no longer a restriction built for Camilla alone. It was a limit Catherine was willing to live under herself. Her point was simple. When George became sovereign, his reign, and his reign's voice, had to belong to him. Not to the memory of his father's popularity, not to the expectations built around a previous household's statements. Then Catherine gave Charles the line that stopped the room. My son should never have to compete with his own mother's voice for the right to be heard as king. Charles looked down at the folder. He didn't answer, no explosion, no dramatic rejection, no sudden order ending the meeting. He simply sat back. Charles could disagree with William's boundary. He could worry about Camilla. He could question whether decades of precedent should be abandoned this completely. But Catherine had removed the easiest defense. He could no longer say the rule existed only because of Camilla. She had surrendered the same future privilege herself. For several moments, the king said nothing. William didn't fill the silence. The decision had reached the point where Charles could see the next reign's voice clearly. One king, one queen, one office, and Camilla no longer guaranteed an institutional platform of her own. But the woman most affected by that decision still hadn't heard it. Charles finally lifted his head and made one request. Camilla should hear it directly. By 7:05, she was on her way to the room. At 7:10 that evening, the door opened and Camilla entered. She knew immediately that something had shifted. Charles was no longer reading. William sat forward, controlled but tense. Catherine remained beside the open folder, one hand resting near the second page. Nobody offered the easy smile that normally softens an awkward family meeting. Camilla looked first at Charles. He didn't explain. That told her enough. William stood and asked her to sit. His tone was measured, almost formal. Camilla took the chair beside Charles and glanced toward the folder. What has happened? William didn't begin with her title. He didn't begin with the press office. He began with the future. He explained that he and Catherine had decided how their reign's voice would operate. When the next reign began, there would be one sovereign at the center of the institution's official statements, supported by one working communications office. Other family members could remain active, respected, visible, but no second voice would continue speaking automatically for the crown beside the new king. Camilla's face changed. She understood the implication faster than William expected. Meaning yours. William corrected her quietly. Meaning the king's. The distinction was deliberate. William wasn't presenting the arrangement as a personal victory over her. He was separating the man from the office. Whoever wore the crown would control what got said in its name. Camilla looked at Catherine, then back to William. And me, the question was shorter than everything that had come before it. Catherine answered first. You remain family. Camilla held her gaze. But not royal. Catherine didn't move. That is not what was said. William stepped in before the exchange could harden. Camilla's lawful status wouldn't be erased by a change of reign. She could give interviews as herself. She could speak on causes that mattered to her. She could be quoted personally whenever anyone chose to ask her opinion. Respect didn't end because Charles's reign ended, but the institutional weight behind her words would. That was the dividing line. Camilla listened without interrupting as William described it in practical terms. Statements from the reigning household would carry crown authority. Statements from anyone else would carry personal opinion only. Official representation to the press would depend on the king's invitation. Her name would no longer sit in the court circular, as though she still spoke on the sovereign's behalf. Nothing was being seized in that room. Nothing was being promised either, and that uncertainty was what Camilla found hardest. She turned toward Charles. So the moment you're gone, I'm silenced. Charles looked at William before answering, but William spoke first. No, Camilla waited. William explained that disappearing and losing automatic institutional voice were not the same thing. A former queen could remain part of national conversation without her every remark being treated as crown position. She could be heard without becoming a second source of official direction. Then he gave the sentence that brought the whole proposal into focus. Family is not the same as government. Camilla went still. For years, her public identity had been built around speaking beside Charles. Engagements, interviews, causes, official quotes attributed to her office. The proposal didn't erase those years, but it refused to guarantee that the authority behind them would survive Charles automatically. That was a much quieter loss, perhaps a harder one to argue against. Camilla looked again at Catherine. The tension between them hadn't disappeared, but something in Catherine's expression made her hesitate. There was no satisfaction there, no sense of victory. Catherine understood exactly what this rule could cost, because she had already placed her own voice beneath it. She told Camilla that if William died first and George became king, she wouldn't ask her son to keep treating her words as though they still carried the crown's authority. No independent platform, no inherited press relationships, no permanent institutional voice beside George simply because she had once been queen. Camilla's expression changed again. This time the resistance weakened. Catherine wasn't demanding a sacrifice she intended to avoid herself. That mattered. The room became quieter. Charles watched his wife. William watched his father. Catherine kept her attention on Camilla, allowing the implication to settle without softening it. For the first time since entering, Camilla stopped asking what she would lose. She began asking what the rule actually was. Was it written only for the widows of kings? Would it apply to every future consort? Could a later sovereign simply reverse it? William glanced toward Catherine, then toward the folder. Those were the exact questions they had expected, and they had prepared an answer. Camilla believed she had reached the end of the announcement. She hadn't. William turned the first page over and revealed a second beneath it. At the top was a heading Camilla hadn't seen before, the one-voice principle. Beneath that heading was a list of names and future situations that made one thing suddenly clear. This rule was much bigger than Camilla, and much bigger than one reign. The second sheet changed the scale of the meeting. Camilla had expected to find her name at the center of it. Instead, the language moved beyond her completely. The principle would apply to every surviving consort who came after the reigning sovereign. Catherine was listed. So was the future spouse of George. Even Charlotte's future position was covered, should circumstances ever place the crown on her head. This wasn't a private arrangement for one difficult transition. It was a succession rule. When one reign ended, its institutional voice ended with it. The next sovereign could invite a former consort to give interviews, speak at events, or comment publicly on causes connected to the crown. But none of it would carry official weight simply because it once had. Authority would have to be renewed every time by whoever actually wore the crown. Camilla read the second page more slowly than the first. That detail mattered, because it removed the argument she had been preparing. She could no longer say the proposal isolated her. Catherine had already accepted it. Future consorts would face it. The structure was designed to survive everyone currently sitting in the room. Charles understood that too. The question was no longer whether his wife deserved to be heard after his reign. The question was whether any former consort's voice should carry institutional weight into the reign of the next sovereign. And William had already asked someone else. Days before Windsor, he had taken the principle privately to Princess Anne. Anne had spent her entire life inside the monarchy. She had watched one reign's voice end and another begin, more than once. William wanted to know whether ending the old model would weaken continuity. Annie's response was brief. Different reign, different voice. William pushed once more. Did she agree with the principle? Anne didn't turn the question into a judgment on Camilla. That was precisely why her answer carried weight. She focused on the crown itself. The next king has to be allowed to speak for himself, nothing more. That distinction protected the point. Loyalty to a former queen could remain personal, warm, visible, without becoming a second official channel. Respect could survive, affection could survive, institutional authority didn't have to. No speech about old grievances, no attack, no emotional score settling. Anne treated the whole matter as structure, and that gave William something he needed. The idea could survive outside the emotions surrounding Camilla specifically. Back at Windsor, William explained that the principle wasn't intended to erase history. It was intended to prevent history from becoming an automatic command over what the public heard as crown truth. The old model had worked in its own time. That didn't mean every future reign had to reproduce it. Charles looked again at the names on the second page. Maybe for the first time that evening, he wasn't reading as Camilla's husband. He was reading as a sovereign, examining a rule that could shape George and possibly generations beyond him. The room had moved far past one press office. It had moved past Camilla entirely. Now it was about whether the monarchy should let old voices keep speaking indefinitely, or reset its authority around whoever actually inherited the crown. Inside the room, Camilla had one more question. Could a future king reverse the principle? William's answer was careful. A sovereign could always shape the voice of his own reign. That was the point. The document wasn't designed to control George from beyond William's lifetime. It was designed to establish an expectation that no previous voice possessed an automatic claim over the next one. That distinction softened nothing. If anything, it made the proposal stronger. Camilla could remain heard because a future king chose to include her. She couldn't claim authority because precedent forced his hand. Charles closed the second page. Nobody spoke. Then the meeting began to break apart. Camilla rose first. Catherine followed. There was no dramatic farewell, only the strained politeness of four people who understood something fundamental had just been placed on paper. William expected his father to end the meeting there. Charles didn't. As Catherine reached the door, Charles asked William to stay behind. Camilla turned once, then continued out with Catherine. The door closed. Father and son were alone, and Charles was no longer interested in asking about Camilla. His next question was about Catherine. There was no folder between them now. No advisors, no careful explanations built for everyone in the room. Just a father looking at his son across the table. With one question left that had nothing to do with Camilla at all, Charles asked whether William had truly thought about what the same rule could one day mean for Catherine's own voice. William answered without hesitation. Every day. The reply changed the tone again. Charles had spent most of the meeting worrying about the woman beside him and the voice she might lose without him. Now he was forcing William to imagine the same absence from the opposite direction. A reign ending early. George inheriting before anyone wanted him to. Catherine still alive, still loved, still carrying years of public trust behind her, but no longer the one whose words automatically meant crown authority. Could William really accept that? Could he imagine Catherine stepping back from the institutional voice of the monarchy, without resentment, without a platform quietly built around everything she had once represented? William looked toward the door Catherine had just walked through. Then he gave the answer Charles hadn't expected, no. But she is. That was the part Charles couldn't dismiss. Catherine hadn't supported the principle because it cost her nothing. She had supported it because she believed the next sovereign had to inherit the freedom to be heard, not just the crown. If that sovereign was George, then even his own mother's voice wouldn't be allowed to compete with his, simply because the public still loved the sound of it. Charles sat with that. The argument had started with Camilla. It ended with Catherine. That was why the decision held. The following morning, Friday the 21st of August, William and Catherine reviewed the final wording again. The language stayed stripped of emotion, no reference to Diana, no criticism of Charles. No line aimed directly at Camilla, nothing that could easily be read as revenge. Just one principle: the next reign will begin with one sovereign, one office, and one voice. William signed first. Then he turned the page toward Catherine. She read the sentence once more before adding her name beside his. 2 signatures. One decision, no celebration followed. There was no victory to announce, because both understood the document described losses they might personally endure themselves. A future boundary that neither of them could pretend was meant for somebody else. The significance was larger than the paper itself. For decades, the British monarchy had let its voice travel forward through whoever had once stood closest to the throne, regardless of whose reign they'd actually served. William and Catherine were choosing something different. Camilla could remain Charles's widow. She could remain part of the family. She could speak personally about the causes that mattered to her and appear wherever the sovereign chose to include her. But her words wouldn't automatically carry the institutional weight of Charles's reign into William's, and Catherine had written herself into the same future. That was the detail that changed everything. If William died first, Popularity wouldn't exempt her, history wouldn't exempt her. Her years beside the king wouldn't automatically let her voice speak over George's. The rule would still stand: one reign, one sovereign, one voice. Charles had heard Windsor believing the meeting was about protocol. He left having heard the monarchy after him. That was why the silence mattered, not because he had lost an argument in a room, but because for a few minutes he had been forced to picture a future in which his own voice had already stopped mattering to the institution he'd spent his life serving. William's had begun, and Camilla's voice from that point forward would depend on the next king choosing to include it, rather than on any promise made during his father's reign. One detail still sits underneath the whole decision: the press office, the department Charles asked about first, and the question William never fully answered. If there is only one voice, who runs the press office when the next reign begins? That single answer could decide whether this principle remains words on paper, or becomes the most visible break with 50 years of royal communications the monarchy has ever made.